essentially I can go to anybody and say, I want my information back. It's my information. You cannot use my information without my consent.
Hello and welcome. It's time for us to have another really interesting conversation. On the line with us right now, we have Mr. Simeon Tassev. Now, he's the Managing Director of Galix, and that's a company that assists organizations by partnering with their management on all levels, helping them to manage and, of course, improve their corporate IT infrastructure and security. Now, he obtained a master's in business administration in economics and has been the Managing Director of Galix for over 26 years now, where he garnered, of course, decades of experience in IT infrastructure and security. Who else would we speak with than someone like Tassev, who's been involved in designing, implementing, and managing the communications and information security infrastructure of a wide variety of organizations? As a credit card security became really important, increasingly over the years, especially with regards to fraud, Mr. Tassev obtained a certification as a Qualified Security Assessor in 2012. Now, that certified him to conduct payment card industry data security standards. Now, this is a standard put in place by major card users and, of course, assessment audits. Now, there is quite a lot more about this gentleman, but you might be interested to know that in January 2001, Tassev obtained the internationally recognized Certified Information System Security Professional certification, talking about the CISSP, and in 2013, he obtained Payment Card Industry Professional certification as well. So, who better to talk about POPIA? For those who haven't heard of what POPIA is, let's say it is basically South Africa's Protection of Personal Information Act, the POPIA Act as it's fondly called. Now, there's a lot about this that many people are not really conversant with yet. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. Although it's been widely publicized, I think a lot of people are still trying to avoid it for many reasons. I suppose compliance is never fun, something for people to do for fun. It is something that they've been forced to do for one reason or another. And POPIA is no different. I think many companies realize that it is quite a ginormous task trying to align and implement the various controls. And I think that's what pretty much slowed down the whole process of adoption, because people just decided that I'm too small, it's not doesn't apply to me. And at the end of the day, it applies to everybody. So it's unfortunate, just an avoidance. It's definitely not a solution.
Okay, so we need to sort of explain who POPIA applies to and what POPIA actually represents. Let's break it down.
Okay, so it is obviously a South African legislation or act from South Africa, so it is relevant to South Africa. The act applies to essentially any person or organization who keeps information or any type of record of personal information of anybody, being a person or jurisdictional person, meaning a company. Now, that is probably one of the differences between POPIA and GDPR, where GDPR only applies to personal individuals, obviously in Europe, and affecting European citizens. From a POPIA perspective, the Act also protects company information, which is quite important because in a lot of instances, the company information is a lot more valuable to different malicious individuals. So obviously that's where they will try and steal that information and obviously use it for whatever intent. But typically that would be the focus on anybody trying to gain by using that information to either do whatever fraudulent activities, exploit personal information or credit card information or company information. Typically that's what this refers to. There are a number of instances where there are people that are exempt. Typically that is government organizations or people that are doing it for the public or collecting that information for various public services. There are various scenarios of exemptions, but essentially most people and organizations out there have to comply with the Act. And that's where it becomes really challenging.
So, when many people talk about acts, they think of compliance. Yeah? But we also have to think from the side of who it's actually protecting. So a lot of people think, that the laws are oftentimes work against them. But let's talk about the protection side of things. Who exactly has it been designed to protect?
So again, the focus is to protect personal information. So in most instances, that will be the individual information. So anybody in South Africa has the right to have their information removed from whatever system, or essentially I can go to anybody and say, I want my information back. It's my information. You cannot use my information without my consent. Okay. And this is what the Act essentially enforces companies to request that consent before utilizing the information for whatever need. Essentially, they can use it for marketing, but this is where the Act very typically explains in terms of what exactly is the intent for using that information. Okay. So if I give the permission to a company to use the information for a specific marketing campaign, that doesn't mean that they can use it for any other campaign, or doesn't mean that they can share it with another company for them to, for example, bombard me with whatever their offers are and trying to sell me whatever their products and goods are. So this is why I do believe that it's important, and it protects everybody, it protects us as the individual.
Okay, fantastic. So as soon as you start thinking about protection, you start thinking about cookie bots. Now, there have been so many cookie bots, pop-ups that have been designed into different types of websites for different types of companies. And I do believe I am guilty of just accepting cookies. I don't know if that makes sense. Am I using the right terms here? I do believe I am.
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Yes, you are using the right terms.
So I just accept. So what essentially have I done in terms of with this new legislation?
So, first of all, in terms of the legislation, all South African websites are now required to have what we call a cookie disclaimer. Okay. So basically, for you to know what you are getting yourself into. Okay. So yes, it's a bit of a tricky situation because some websites may not allow you to, pass or, for example, block the cookies on that specific site, or i.e. being functional, the website being functional without those cookies. So if you want to, for whatever reason, do something on the website, you may have to accept the cookies. But at least that disclaimer tells you what the cookie will do, i.e. what information it will collect from you by accepting this. And that gives you the power to make that decision. If for whatever reason you don't want to share the data and you will be getting or giving that information for in exchange for whatever services or whatever you're trying to get, that is your choice, and that's what this is about. As you correctly said, there is a lot of artificially designed, what we call bots, out there collecting that type of information for various reasons. Some of it is purely analytical, some of it is a lot more targeted. Either way, at the end of the day, the whole point of this act is to make it your choice. Do you want to be part of that or not?
All right, fantastic. So how then can I ensure that my company becomes compliant in the best possible way? I don't want my customers, being constantly bombarded with these cookie pop-ups, or should we call them disclaimers now? That's the official term, cookie disclaimers all the time. And then I feel like I need to go for a certain exam or get a certification at this point to know if I'm on the right side of the track or not. So talk to us about that.
So essentially for companies to become compliant, there's no, unfortunately, one generic scenario where everybody will do this and that's, how you become compliant. The Act does have different conditions that you have to meet, and from there are different requirements. The most common requirements is for you to understand, and that's typically what we do when we engage with our clients, to understand what is actually relevant to you, what is relevant to you as an organization, you as an individual, and for your clients. Because by doing that, you're understanding your data. And understanding your data is the first step of protecting the data. Now, needless to say, during that process, you may find that you've collected a lot of information which was sort of nice to have, but you don't actually need. So again, the first recommendation will be, remove that information.
Okay.
Just dispose of it. Simple. But at the end of the day, we will always have personal information collected. Being in a private capacity or as a business, there's always going to be a large volume of that personal information being collected. And this is where you have to have the relevant policies and procedures in place to ensure that that data is protected and managed correctly. Now, the management is where the Act is quite explicit in terms of what do you need to do in terms of managing that data. For example, you have to have the processes to allow your people or your clients, for example, to unsubscribe from your company. And in doing so, removing that data or updating the data or purely just allowing you to store it, but making sure that there's a consent for a specific service, like I mentioned earlier, or a specific function. That is the key for when, people start becoming compliant, is to be able to understand their data, to understand their processes, because, the data gets generated based on the business. And from there, implement whatever necessary controls to protect that data and to have the assurance for your clients and employees, because that also applies to protecting the information of your own employees, to have that assurance that you've done everything.
All right. So it's said that organizations often struggle when it comes to figuring out where to start when addressing Popi and, of course, GDPR, right? But what I'm thinking about is the requirements. Is there some kind of assessment? Is there some kind of, in quote, task force? Are there a set of people that can come in, do an assessment for you to see if you're foolproof or not? And is this the sort of service you would probably provide on the side?
So, again, unfortunately, there is no specific standard to do this kind of assessment.
Okay.
So most organizations such as ourselves, which would provide this level of consulting, we would go through a process of what is relevant to you as an organization, and then see which of the required controls will be applicable in your environment. Yes, there are some specifics in terms of a simple checklist. There are some specific documents that one would have to have. Again, and those documents would be different types of policies, processes, different types of manuals. And all those forms part of that assessment for us to understand what is it that you have in place. Okay. Now, again, you can combine those into one big operational document, call it Popi policy, or you can have multiple policies dealing with specific aspects of what you're trying to achieve. But at the end of the day, it has to start with understanding what's applicable to you, understanding what you have in place, what you don't have in place. And in doing that, hopefully identify gaps and hopefully resolve those in order to be compliant.
Thanks so much for that. Okay, so there is sometimes this mindset where small companies especially tend to feel like they can get away with it. They can, just let it slide. Let's talk about worst case scenarios. Let's talk consequences. Consequences with not complying with the Act, so to speak. And what could the disadvantages be? So,
first of all, when dealing with the Act responsibilities that are required and have to be assigned, the main role that is automatically assigned to highest level of management of the company, for example, CEO or managing director or general manager, whatever the highest level is. It's what it's called an information officer. Okay. So there is a role that automatically gets assigned. If that role is not assigned to anybody else, and yes, there is the option for that role to be assigned to somebody else, but essentially this is the role that is responsible and accountable for the implementation and maintenance of the compliance. Okay. Now the reason I'm mentioning that because there are possible fines as well as possible imprisonment. So if you're not compliant, and there are limits to that. I mean, obviously, so we're talking 10 million South African rands, or 10 years of imprisonment, or both, or combination of the two. So from a fine perspective, it's not a huge amount from an international standards perspective, but it's definitely not an amount to be ignored. However, the biggest challenge or biggest impact in many cases is essentially your reputational damage. So a lot of companies, obviously have a business model based on different levels of trust with their clients. So the moment you have that risk and the moment you are non-compliant and therefore you're penalized and therefore publicized, you will have that reputational damage. And that's one thing that is very, very difficult to fix. Having a fine and having some findings and, being able to address that, yes, with a little bit of money and a little bit of time, all that can be resolved. But how many clients would you lose in the process and then, you won't be able to get them back? So that's what people don't understand. And on top of that, we're also seeing that a lot of companies are now starting to base their relations and even future relations on the Popi Act. Because it's a chain reaction. If we need to do business and we need to exchange information, we have to have clear responsibilities who is responsible for that information at what point in time. And therefore, it now has to go into some form of an agreement where it clearly states that I'm giving you this information and the moment I, put it in your hands or I send it to you, you are now responsible. But we still keep, in many instances, our responsibility towards our clients. Because, I may give it to a service provider that I've come up with an agreement in terms of providing you whatever service. But at the end of the day, my clients have entrusted me with their information. They didn't entrust it to whoever I chose to do business with. So that's why that chain reaction is very important for people to understand that there is a risk of dealing with third parties which obviously can perform whatever function, data processing typically, on your behalf, and that would have an impact on you as well and potentially on your reputation.
So let's see if we can do some kind of compare and contrast to the global standards now, the GDPR, global compliance, and Popi. So let's do a compare and contrast. Is there anything that you believe South Africa needed more of and less of in the new Popi as compared to what's applicable in GDPR?
I don't believe so. I think the Popi Act is very much aligned with international standards. GDPR is the European legislation, which essentially has quite a substantial impact on many companies in South Africa dealing with European business or subjects from Europe, essentially citizens of Europe. And hence why it was important to align with GDPR. There are various other legislations, international legislations that you following the same principles, but typically Popi will be compared with GDPR. So in terms of a comparison, there have been a number of comparisons, and again there's quite a substantial alignment between the two. In some instances, the differences would be very much just a question of definition. So, for example, in GDPR, there's a data controller. In Popi, there's a responsible party.
Okay.
In GDPR, there's a data processor. In Popi, there's an operator. But at the end of the day, they have the same role. There are certain differences. For example, in GDPR, you can assign the role to an external person or third party to be in their case, is not information officer, but the same role as information officer in Popia.
Okay.
In South Africa, the Popia the role has to be assigned, it has to be part of the organization.
Okay.
So in that sense, there are some subtle differences, but nothing that I could say, no, this is
nothing really
essentially a major difference.
Okay.
Again, sometimes GDPR has some specifics which Popia may not have.
Okay.
For example, if you have an incident in GDPR, you have to report it within 72 hours.
Okay.
In Popia, there's no such specific parameter.
Okay.
But again, as an alignment, we all say, well, your policy needs to say 72 hours because that's where it meets most requirements anyway. So I think this is typically what the difference is. And as I said, the difference between GDPR and Popia is that Popia applies to the juristic and natural person, not just natural person as an individual, which is what GDPR only applies.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for clearing that up. But I'm then thinking of companies that have become multinational. So let's think of MultiChoice, for instance, that functions in so many different countries all over Africa. Now, I understand that they are based in South Africa. Would it mean that they would be functioning with Popia or with GDPR?
So Popia is definitely legislation that they will have to comply with.
Okay.
If they do have clients which are European citizens, which I believe they do, then they will have to comply with GDPR as well. So it's not a choice.
Okay.
It's not a question of, I can choose which one. Whatever is applicable, same principle apply. For example, we mentioned, we were speaking early on about the credit card industry. So for example, credit card information is personal information. That doesn't mean that personal information is covered in Popia, so let's not be compliant with PCI-DSS.
Okay.
We still need to be compliant with all the standards that are applicable for the specific type of information that we're trying to protect.
Okay.
So unfortunately, the large organizations have a substantial list of standards and compliances to adhere to. And yes, that's why they will have the big departments that will have to deal with it.
And in the end, deal with it they must. And at this point, I think we can wrap it up here. But just on a final note, any advice for maybe, a company management team who are still a bit flustered about it and haven't really made any moves? What quick message would you have for them?
I think the quick message is that understand what the requirements are. It's quite clear, but understand what the requirements are. Understand what the various roles and responsibilities are within your organization, including third parties. With the appointment of the relevant, from South African perspective, as I said, information officer, that would define the internal roles. Now, from there, there's various other roles that have to be defined within the organization, and then perform some form of a readiness assessment or some form of assessment where you understand where your gaps are. Knowing is 80% of the job.
Okay.
Putting the policy in place, the controls, yes, sometimes, will take time for various reasons. If you require technology to implement some of those controls, it may require investment. But at the end of the day, knowing about it is the key thing. South African regulator wants to see that you have done whatever you can, and the intent was there to protect information. That's the first thing they want to see.
All right.
If you've been negligent about it, then you have a problem.
And at this point, I have to say a very big thank you to you for taking out time from your extremely busy schedule. Mr. Simeon Tassev here, the Managing Director of Galix. Now, I'm really, really glad we're able to clear some things up. And hopefully we've been able to connect with company owner or manager out there who had some doubts about this Popi Act. All right then. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right then. Now that was Mr. Simeon Tassev there, the Managing Director of Galix, a company that assists organizations by partnering with their management on all levels. Now, they're into helping them manage and improve their corporate IT infrastructure and security. And that is a very important part of business, especially the way the world is going. I have to say, at this point, your questions and contributions are always welcome. You can always place a comment or send a contribution via social media. We're at Africa Biz Radio on Twitter, and of course at Africa Business Radio on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Can't wait to hear from you. If you have any information you'd like to share with us, or you'd like to be on a podcast yourself, you can always look out for us on africabusinessradio.com. Just connect with us. My name is Titilayo Oyinso, and thanks for listening.